Hi, I'm Jessica. 3 years ago, my husband's family cornered me in their marble-floored dining room, called me a thief and a liar, and gave me exactly 2 hours to disappear from their lives forever. They believed every twisted story my sister-in-law fed them, never once asking for my side of the truth. That evening, I drove away 7 months pregnant, with nothing but a duffel bag and $37 to my name. What they didn't realize was that I was carrying their first grandchild, the future heir to everything they held precious. And they had absolutely no clue about the devastating secret I'd uncovered just days before in their pristine basement. A secret so explosive it would eventually bring their entire world crashing down around them. Now, 3 years later, their family name is destroyed, their fortune is gone, and I'm the only person left standing with the power to save them from complete ruin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Jessica Marie Chen, and I need you to understand who I was before everything changed. I grew up in a small apartment above my grandmother's bakery in Garden Grove, where the smell of fresh bread and jasmine tea filled every corner of my childhood. My parents worked double shifts at the electronics factory, so it was my grandmother who taught me that respect is earned through kindness, not demanded through fear. I was the first person in my family to graduate college, working nights at a diner to pay for my accounting degree while maintaining a perfect GPA. I'm not telling you this to brag, but because you need to understand that I built everything I had through honest work and determination. I wasn't looking for shortcuts or handouts when I met David Morrison at a coffee shop near UC Irvine during my senior year. David was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Tall, confident, with that easy smile that comes from never having to worry about money. He drove a BMW his parents bought him for his birthday, wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most fascinating person in any room. He would listen to my stories about growing up above the bakery, like they were the most interesting things he'd ever heard. What drew me to David wasn't his money, though I'd be lying if I said the security wasn't appealing. It was how he seemed, genuinely curious about my world. He'd ask my grandmother about her recipes, help me carry textbooks between classes, and stay up late helping me study for my CPA exam. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, kneeling in the same coffee shop where we met, I genuinely believed I'd found my person. The Morrison family seemed to embrace me from the beginning. David's mother, Margaret, was this elegant woman who always smelled like expensive perfume and spoke in a soft Southern accent that made everything sound gracious. She'd insist I call her Mom Margaret, and would spend hours teaching me about wine, pairings, and proper table settings. Not in a condescending way, but like she was genuinely excited to share these traditions with someone new. Robert, David's father, was quieter, but equally warm. A successful businessman who owned several commercial properties throughout Orange County, he had this presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He'd pull me aside at family gatherings to ask about my work at the accounting firm, nodding thoughtfully when I explained complex tax strategies or audit procedures. He made me feel valued for my mind, not just as David's girlfriend. David's siblings were harder to read, but I attributed their coolness to the natural protectiveness that comes with close family bonds. Lisa, his younger sister, was beautiful in that effortless way that money can buy. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect everything. She worked in public relations for a nonprofit, though she never seemed particularly passionate about it. She'd make polite conversation with me at family dinners, but there was always something calculating in her eyes, like she was measuring me against some invisible standard. Mark, the middle child, was pursuing his MBA while working part-time at one of his father's companies. He had David's charm, but with sharper edges, and a habit of asking personal questions that felt invasive rather than friendly. He'd want to know about my clients at the accounting firm, what kind of files I had access to, which wealthy families I worked with. I thought he was just making conversation about my career. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of as a little girl. Margaret insisted on paying for everything, from the designer dress to the elaborate reception at the Ritz-Carlton. I protested, initially, knowing my own family couldn't contribute much, but she waved away my concerns with such genuine warmth that I felt selfish for even bringing it up. Walking down that aisle, seeing David's face light up as I approached, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. Our first year of marriage was blissful. We moved into a beautiful townhouse in Tustin that Robert helped us purchase, and I threw myself into building my career while David finished his graduate program in business management. Margaret would call just to chat, asking about my day or inviting me to lunch with her friends. Robert would email me articles about tax law changes he thought I'd find interesting. I felt genuinely loved and accepted in a way I'd never experienced before. When I discovered I was pregnant 8 months into our marriage, the Morrison family's joy seemed authentic and overwhelming. Margaret immediately started planning nursery designs and researching the best pediatricians in the area. Robert began talking about setting up trust funds and education savings accounts. David was over the moon, already picking out names and talking about teaching our child to play baseball in the backyard. I was working at Hamilton & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm that specialized in high-net-worth individuals and small businesses. My supervisor, Patricia, had been grooming me for a promotion to senior associate, and my client roster included some of the wealthiest families in Orange County. The work was challenging and rewarding, and I felt like I was finally building the stable, successful life I'd always wanted. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the first 2 trimesters. Margaret threw me an elaborate baby shower at the country club, complete with a 5-tier cake and gifts that probably cost more than my car. The nursery in our townhouse was transformed into something out of a design magazine, with custom furniture and hand-painted murals. David's entire family seemed invested in welcoming this baby into the world. It was during my 7th month that things began to shift in ways so subtle I almost missed them entirely. Lisa started asking more pointed questions about my work, specifically about which clients had offshore accounts or international investments. She'd frame it as casual interest in my career, but there was an intensity to her curiosity that made me uncomfortable. When I'd deflect or change the subject, she'd push just a little harder before backing off with a laugh. Mark began showing up at our townhouse unannounced, always with some excuse about needing to borrow something from David. But David would often be at school or work, and Mark would linger, making conversation about my pregnancy while his eyes wandered around our home office where I kept client files. He'd ask about my access to confidential information, whether I ever worked from home, how secure our computer network was. Even Margaret's warmth began to feel different. She'd invite me to lunch and spend most of the meal asking detailed questions about wealthy families in the area. Did I know the Hendersons who owned the chain of car dealerships? What about the Williamses who had the construction company? Her questions always seemed innocent enough individually, but together they painted a picture of someone fishing for specific information. David seemed oblivious to these changes, or maybe I was being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones can make you see threats where none exist, and I'd always been somewhat anxious about fitting into his family's world. When I mentioned my concerns to him, he'd laugh and remind me that his family loved me, that they were just excited about the baby and curious about my interesting career. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. David was at his evening MBA class, and I was at Margaret and Robert's house helping with some light housework. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had been feeling under the weather, and I'd offered to help with laundry and basic cleaning. It was the kind of gesture that came naturally to me, having grown up helping my grandmother with everything around the bakery. I was in the basement, transferring clothes from the washer to the dryer, when I accidentally knocked over a cardboard box that had been stacked on top of the filing cabinet. papers scattered across the concrete floor, and as I knelt down to gather them up, my trained accountant's eye caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Bank statements. But not for any accounts I'd ever seen before. These were from offshore banks in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and the British Virgin Islands. The account holders were listed as various LLC entities with names like Sunset Holdings and Pacific Investment Group. But Robert Morrison's signature was on every single transfer authorization, and the amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars, moving in and out of these accounts in patterns that could only be described as systematic money laundering. My hands shook as I flipped through more documents. Tax returns that showed dramatically different income figures than what was being reported to these foreign banks. Shell company and corporation papers for businesses that existed only on paper. Investment records for properties that were being used to wash dirty money through seemingly legitimate real estate transactions. Robert Morrison wasn't just a successful businessman. He was running a sophisticated tax evasion and money laundering operation that had been going on for at least 7 years, based on the dates I could see, the family's comfortable lifestyle, their generosity toward David and me, the elaborate wedding, even our townhouse. It was all built on illegal money that should have been reported to the IRS. I carefully gathered the papers and put them back. In the box, my mind racing. This explained so many things. Lisa's questions about my wealthy clients weren't idle curiosity. She was looking for potential targets or partners for her father's schemes. Mark's interest in my access to confidential financial information wasn't career networking. He was evaluating whether I could be useful to their operation or whether I posed a threat. The family's sudden interest in my pregnancy took on a sinister new meaning. They weren't just excited about their first grandchild. They were concerned about having someone with my professional background and legal obligations becoming a permanent part of their family. As a CPA, I was bound by ethical standards that would require me to report suspected financial crimes. As their daughter-in-law, I was in a position to stumble across evidence of their activities. I finished the laundry in a daze, my mind spinning with the implications of what I'd discovered. When Margaret came downstairs to check on me, I managed to act normal, chatting about baby names and nursery decorations while my heart pounded in my chest. She seemed satisfied that nothing was amiss, but I caught her glancing at the filing cabinet where the box was stored. Driving home that night, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The Morrison family's wealth, their social connections, their influence in the community, it was all built on a foundation of criminal activity. And now I was carrying their grandchild, tied to them in a way that would make it impossible to simply walk away from what I'd learned. I didn't tell David immediately. Part of me hoped I'd misunderstood something, that there was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen. But my professional training told me otherwise. Those documents showed clear evidence of multiple federal crimes, and the Morrison family had been getting away with it for years because they were careful, connected, and smart enough to stay under the radar. The next few days passed in a blur of normal activities that felt anything but normal. David and I went to dinner with his parents, and I found myself studying Robert's face as he talked about his business ventures, looking for signs of the criminal I now knew him to be. Margaret continued planning for the baby's arrival, and I wondered if her enthusiasm was genuine or if she was worried about what complications my presence might bring to their operations. It was Lisa who finally forced the issue. She called me on a Saturday morning when David was playing golf with his father and brother, asking if she could come over to help organize the nursery. When she arrived, she didn't head upstairs to the baby's room. Instead, she sat down at our kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the sisterly affection she'd always shown me. She knew. Somehow she'd figured out that I'd seen something in that basement, and she was there to find out exactly how much I knew. The conversation that followed would change everything, setting in motion the events that would ultimately destroy the Morrison family and transform me from a naive young wife into someone strong enough to stand alone against people who had no limits to what they'd do to protect their secrets. Lisa's voice cut through the morning silence like broken glass. She sat across from me at my own kitchen table, her manicured fingers drumming against the wooden surface in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. The woman I'd known for 3 years, who had helped me pick out my wedding dress and thrown me a bridal shower, was gone. In her place sat someone cold and predatory, watching me with the patience of a hunter who knew her prey was already trapped. "You've been busy lately, haven't you, Jessica?" she said, tilting her head slightly. The gesture might have looked innocent to anyone else, but I could see the calculation behind her perfectly applied makeup. "Mom mentioned you were so helpful the other day, doing laundry and cleaning. She was touched by your thoughtfulness." I kept my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my throat. "I like helping your parents. They've been so good to me and David." My hand instinctively moved to rest on my rounded belly, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Lisa's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. "That's what makes this so difficult. You've become such a part of our family. But family means loyalty, Jessica. It means understanding that some things are private, sacred even. Some things that outsiders might misunderstand." The word outsiders hit me like a physical blow. After 3 years of marriage, a pregnancy, countless family dinners and holidays, I was still an outsider in her eyes. I'd always known there was a distance between me and David's siblings, but I'd attributed it to different backgrounds and interests. Now I realized it had been something much more deliberate and cruel. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Lisa," I said, though we both knew I understood perfectly. The documents in that basement might as well have been spread out between us on the table. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My father has worked his entire life to build something meaningful for this family. He's provided for all of us, given David opportunities, given you opportunities. That house you're living in, the car you drive, the security you feel, all of it comes from his success. And sometimes success requires making difficult choices that people on the outside might not understand." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of calling systematic tax evasion and money laundering difficult choices, but the seriousness in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't making excuses or trying to justify anything. She was delivering a warning wrapped in velvet threats. "Some people," she continued, "might see paperwork or financial documents and jump to conclusions. They might think they understand business practices that are actually perfectly legal, just sophisticated, the kind of sophisticated that requires discretion and family loyalty to maintain." The baby kicked against my ribs as if sensing my elevated heart rate. I took a slow breath, trying to project calmness I didn't feel. "Lisa, if you have concerns about something, maybe you should talk to David or your parents directly." Her laugh was like ice cracking. "Oh, we will be. In fact, we already have been. You see, Jessica, loyalty works both ways in a family. When someone threatens the security and stability we've all worked to build, the family has to protect itself, even from members who might not realize the damage they could cause." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around us. Through the window, I could see our neighbors going about their Saturday morning routines, walking dogs and washing cars, completely unaware that my world was imploding just yards away from their peaceful suburban lives. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Lisa reached into her designer purse and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the table between us with deliberate ceremony. "We know about the meetings, Jessica, the conversations, with people who have no business knowing about our family's private affairs. We know about the questions you've been asking at work about certain families, certain business practices. We know about the copies you've been making." My blood ran cold. "What meetings? What copies? Lisa, you're not making any sense." She opened the folder and spread out a series of photographs. They were grainy, obviously taken from a distance, but they clearly showed me in various public places around Orange County. Having lunch with my college friend Sarah at a restaurant in Newport Beach. Talking to my supervisor Patricia outside our office building. Meeting with a potential new client at a coffee shop in Irvine. These photos don't show anything inappropriate, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Don't they? Lisa's smile was triumphant. That woman you had lunch with in Newport Beach works for Morrison Industries. Strange coincidence, don't you think? And this man you met with for coffee, he's been asking questions around town about offshore investment opportunities. Very specific. Questions about the kind of services my father's business provides. I stared at the photos, my mind racing. Sarah worked in marketing for a tech company, not Morrison Industries. The man in the coffee shop photo was James Liu, a restaurant owner who'd asked me to help with his business taxes. But I could see how these innocent interactions could be twisted into something sinister when viewed through the lens of paranoia and guilt. You're reaching, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it didn't matter. They weren't looking for truth, they were building a case. Lisa leaned back in her chair, satisfied with my reaction. There's more. The credit card charges, to office supply stores, always in cash. The extra hours you've been working, staying late when everyone else has gone home. The questions you've been asking your clients about international banking and investment strategies. It all paints a very clear picture of someone gathering information for purposes that aren't in our family's best interests. Each accusation felt like a physical blow. The office supplies were for organizing my client files and preparing tax documents. The extra hours were because I was trying to get ahead on my work before the baby arrived. The questions about international banking came from legitimate client inquiries that were part of my job. But I could see how each innocent action had been cataloged and reframed as evidence of betrayal. You've been watching me, I said, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. For how long? Long enough, Lisa replied. Long enough to see a pattern of behavior that suggests you're not the person we thought you were when David brought you into our family. The front door opened, and I heard David's voice calling out that he was home from golf. Lisa immediately shifted, her posture relaxing and her expression softening into something resembling the sisterly affection she'd always shown me. By the time David walked into the kitchen, she was smiling warmly and asking about my morning sickness. Hey, babe, David said, kissing my cheek before grabbing a water bottle from the refrigerator. Lisa, what brings you by so early? Just wanted to check on Jessica and see if she needed help with anything, Lisa said, her voice so normal and caring that I wondered if I'd imagined the entire conversation. We were just talking about how excited everyone is for the baby to arrive. David beamed, his hand joining mine on my belly. Dad and Mark are already planning fishing trips and baseball games. This kid is going to be so spoiled. The love and pride in his voice made my heart ache, knowing what was coming. Lisa gathered up the folder and photos, sliding them back into her purse with practiced efficiency. I should get going. Mom wants me to help her with some party planning. This afternoon. She stood and hugged me goodbye, whispering in my ear just loud enough for me to hear, but not David. Think about what we discussed. Family loyalty is everything. After she left, David settled beside me on the couch, pulling me close against his side. You seem tense, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. Everything okay? I wanted to tell him everything, about the documents I'd found, about Lisa's threats, about the photos and accusations. But looking at his relaxed, happy expression, I realized he might not believe me. Or worse, he might already know. The thought that my own husband could be complicit in his family's criminal activities and in their campaign against me was almost too painful to consider. Just tired, I said instead. The baby's been keeping me up at night. He rubbed my back gently. Not much longer now. Then we'll both be up all night for different reasons. His laugh was warm and genuine, and for a moment I could pretend everything was normal, that we were just a young couple excitedly awaiting their first child. But that illusion shattered 2 days later, when Margaret called and asked me to come over for Sunday dinner. Her voice had an edge I'd never heard before, a formality that replaced the warmth I'd grown accustomed to. When I asked if David would be joining us, she said he'd be along later, that they wanted to spend some time with me first. I should have made an excuse. I should have insisted that David come with me or suggested we postpone until he could be there from the beginning. But some part of me hoped that I could still fix whatever was broken, that I could somehow convince them that their suspicions were unfounded and restore the relationship that had meant so much to me. The Morrison house had always felt like a sanctuary to me. Set back from the street behind mature oak trees, with its warm stone exterior and welcoming front porch, it represented everything I'd never had growing up. Stability, tradition, the kind of generational wealth that provided security and opportunities. Walking up that familiar pathway on that Sunday afternoon felt like approaching my own execution. Margaret opened the door before I could knock, her smile tight and her eyes avoiding mine. "Jessica, dear, come in. Everyone's waiting in the living room." The endearment sounded forced, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed but didn't believe. The living room had been rearranged. Instead of the comfortable, casual seating arrangement I was used to, the chairs had been positioned to face the sofa where I was clearly expected to sit. Robert sat in his leather recliner, his expression grim and formal. Lisa and Mark flanked him like bodyguards, their faces masks of disappointment and betrayal. Margaret took her place beside Robert, her hands folded in her lap like she was attending a funeral. I lowered myself carefully onto the sofa, my advanced pregnancy making the movement awkward and uncomfortable. The baby seemed to sense my anxiety, shifting restlessly and pressing against my ribs. I placed both hands on my belly, a gesture that was both protective and defensive. Robert cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Jessica, we've asked you here because some concerns have come to our attention. Serious concerns about your behavior and your commitment to this family?" My mouth went dry. "What kind of concerns?" Lisa leaned forward, her expression a perfect mixture of sadness and accusation. "We know about the information you've been gathering, Jessica, the documents you've been copying, the meetings you've been having. We know about your plan to sell our family's private business information to competitors." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. "That's insane. I would never do anything like that. I don't even know what information you're talking about." Mark pulled out a tablet and began swiping through what looked like financial records. "These are copies of documents from Dad's files. Confidential business information that somehow ended up photographed and stored on a cloud account linked to your personal email address." I stared at the screen, recognizing some of the papers I'd seen scattered on the basement floor. But the idea that I had photographed them or stored them anywhere was completely false. I never took pictures of anything. I never accessed any cloud account. Mark, you have to know that's not true. "The digital forensics don't lie," Robert said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "The photos were taken from your phone, uploaded to an account registered in your name, and shared with an IP address that traces back to Morrison Industries." Morrison Industries, the company Lisa had mentioned in the photos, the same name, that had appeared on some of the shell company documents I'd seen. They weren't just framing me for theft. They were creating evidence that I was selling information to their competitors, information that would implicate them in money laundering if it fell into the wrong hands. "This is elaborate," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "You're creating evidence that doesn't exist to support accusations that aren't true. Why would you do this to me? To David? To your own grandchild?" Margaret spoke for the first time, her southern accent more pronounced than usual. "Because family comes first, Jessica. always. And when someone threatens the security and stability of this family, even someone we love, we have to protect ourselves and our children. The words hit me like physical blows. Someone we love. Past tense. I was no longer part of their circle of protection. I had become the threat they needed to neutralize. "Where's David?" I asked, looking around the room. "Why isn't my husband here for this conversation?" "David is with his attorney," Robert said calmly, "discussing the best way to handle the divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. Given the criminal nature of your activities, we felt it was important to protect his interests and the interests of our grandchild." Divorce. The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. They weren't just planning to discredit me. They were planning to take everything. My husband, my home, my child, my reputation, my freedom. The scope of their betrayal was breathtaking in its completeness. I stood up as quickly as my pregnancy would allow, my vision swimming with rage and panic. "You can't do this. David would never agree to this. He loves me. He loves our baby. He wouldn't believe these lies." Lisa's smile was cruel and satisfied. "David has seen the evidence, Jessica. The photos, the financial records, the digital forensics. He's seen proof that his wife has been systematically betraying his family's trust and potentially breaking federal laws. He's heartbroken, but he's not stupid." The room spun around me, David knew. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, who'd held my hand through morning sickness and late-night fears about becoming parents, had seen fabricated evidence of my betrayal and chosen to believe it over trusting the woman who'd shared his bed for 3 years. "I want to talk to him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible right now," Margaret said, her tone gentle but firm. "David needs space to process this situation and make decisions about his future and the baby's future. Having contact with you would only make things harder for everyone involved." Robert stood up, his presence commanding even in this moment of personal destruction. "Jessica, we're prepared to handle this situation quietly and privately. No criminal charges need to be filed if you're willing to cooperate with certain conditions." I should have walked out then. I should have demanded to speak to David, called a lawyer, fought back against their manufactured evidence and coordinated attack. Instead, I found myself asking, "What conditions?" "You'll sign divorce papers that give David full custody of the child, with supervised visitation rights for you. You'll resign from your position at the accounting firm and agree not to work in financial services in Orange County. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding any business information you may have been exposed to during your marriage. And you'll relocate outside of California within 60 days of the baby's birth." Each condition felt like another nail in my coffin. They weren't just destroying my marriage, they were systematically dismantling my entire life, making it impossible for me to rebuild anywhere near my child or the career I'd worked so hard to establish. "And if I don't agree to these conditions?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Mark's expression was coldly professional. "Then we'll be forced to pursue criminal charges for theft of confidential business information, industrial espionage, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence is overwhelming, Jessica. You'd be looking at federal prison time, and David would still get full custody of the baby." The trap was perfect. Agree to their demands and lose everything while maintaining some slim hope of supervised visits with my child. Refuse and face criminal prosecution that would not only destroy me, but ensure I'd never have any meaningful relationship with my baby. They'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency, and executed their attack with surgical precision. I looked around the room at faces that had once welcomed me with warmth and acceptance. Margaret, who'd taught me to make her famous. Peach Cobbler, and shared stories about David's childhood. Robert, who'd asked my opinion on business decisions and made me feel valued for my intelligence. Lisa and Mark, who'd been my siblings for 3 years, who'd stood beside me at my wedding and celebrated every milestone in my marriage. All of that had been an illusion. From the moment I'd married into this family, I'd been under evaluation, my every action monitored and cataloged for potential threats to their criminal enterprise. The love and acceptance I'd felt had been conditional, temporary, subject to revocation the moment I became inconvenient or dangerous to their carefully constructed facade. "I need time to think," I said finally, my voice hoarse with unshed tears. "Of course," Margaret said, her tone now businesslike and efficient. "But not too much time. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the harder it becomes for everyone involved. We'll need your answer by tomorrow evening." I gathered my purse and walked toward the door, each step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. At the threshold, I turned back to look at the 4 people who'd just systematically destroyed my life. "What about David?" I asked. "When do I get to talk to my husband?" Robert's expression was almost pitying. "Jessica, David doesn't want to see you right now. Maybe someday, after you've had time to get your life together and prove that you're not the person these actions suggest you are. But right now, contact with you would be too painful for him." I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice to collect myself. The townhouse that had been our happy home for 2 years looked foreign and unwelcoming. David's car wasn't in the driveway, and when I used my key to enter, I found packed suitcases waiting by the front door. A note on the kitchen counter, written in David's familiar handwriting, contained only a few lines. "Jessica, I can't believe what you've done to our family. I need you to be gone when I get back. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce and custody arrangements. I'm sorry it has to end this way, but you've left me no choice." No choice. The same words his family had used to justify their attack on me. I wondered if he'd written those words himself, or if they'd been dictated to him by people who'd been planning this moment long before I'd ever stumbled across those documents in the basement. I packed what I could fit in my car, leaving behind wedding photos and furniture and all the physical reminders of the life I'd thought I was building. As I drove away from the townhouse for the last time, I realized that the Morrison family had made one crucial mistake in their perfectly executed plan. They'd assumed I was the same naive young woman who'd fallen in love with their son 3 years ago. They'd assumed I would quietly disappear, broken and defeated, grateful for whatever scraps of contact with my child they might allow me. They'd assumed that destroying my marriage and threatening my freedom would be enough to ensure my silence about what I'd discovered in that basement. They had no idea what I was capable of when I had nothing left to lose. And they were about to find out that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one who's been backed into a corner with no way out except straight through their enemies. The motel room I rented that night was everything their beautiful home wasn't. Cramped, shabby, smelling of disinfectant and old cigarette smoke. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on my belly where my daughter was moving restlessly, and began to plan my counterattack. The silence in that motel room was deafening. Not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow emptiness that comes after everything familiar has been stripped away. I sat cross-legged on the scratchy bedspread, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees, staring at a blank document that should have been my resignation letter from Hamilton and Associates. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling not from pregnancy hormones, but from pure rage. The Morrison family expected me to disappear quietly, to sign their papers and fade into whatever exile they'd constructed for me. They expected gratitude for their mercy in not pursuing criminal charges for crimes I'd never committed. They expected me to accept that my marriage was over, that my child would grow up calling another woman mama, that my career in accounting was finished before I'd even reached my prime. What they didn't expect was for me to remember exactly who I was before I became David Morrison's wife. I closed the laptop and pulled out my phone, scrolling through contacts I hadn't called in months. My grandmother had always told me that when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time. The Morrison family had just shown me exactly who they were, and I was finally ready to believe it. But more importantly, I was ready to show them who I really was. I started with the basics. Opening my laptop again, I created a new folder on my desktop and labeled it simply Evidence. Then I began documenting everything I could remember. From the past 72 hours, every conversation, every threat, every lie they'd told about me. I wrote down the exact wording of Robert's ultimatum, Margaret's cold dismissal, Lisa's calculated cruelty. I described the fabricated photos, the false digital evidence, the systematic way they'd built their case against me. Writing it all down made the scope of their conspiracy even more apparent. This wasn't a family reacting emotionally to a perceived betrayal. This was a coordinated attack that had been planned and executed with military precision. They'd been watching me for weeks, maybe months, cataloging my movements and preparing their false narrative. The only question was whether they'd always planned to destroy me, or if my discovery of those basement documents had simply accelerated their timeline. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief and chilling. "Hope, you're making the right choice. Think about your baby's future." No signature, but I knew it was from one of them. The implied threat made my skin crawl, but it also crystallized something important in my mind. They were still worried about what I might do, which meant they weren't as confident in their position as they'd pretended to be. I walked to the bathroom and studied my reflection in the spotted mirror. 7 months pregnant, exhausted, wearing the same clothes I'd put on yesterday morning when I'd still been married and living in my beautiful townhouse. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, but she was also familiar in a way that surprised me. She looked like the girl who'd worked double shifts to pay for college, who'd studied accounting while her classmates partied, who'd built a successful career from nothing but determination and intelligence. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that girl. Marriage to David had been wonderful in many ways, but it had also made me softer, more dependent, more willing to let other people make decisions that affected my life. The Morrison family's wealth and connections had seemed like a safety net, but now I realized it had been a trap. I'd traded my independence for their approval, and they'd been all too happy to make that trade because it gave them control over me. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They thought destroying my marriage and threatening my freedom would break me. Instead, it had awakened something I'd almost forgotten I possessed. The same fierce determination that had gotten me through college, that had earned me respect in a competitive field, that had made me successful long before I'd ever met David Morrison. I pulled out a yellow legal pad I'd found in the motel room desk and began making lists. People I could trust, resources I could access, evidence I could gather. The lists were short at first, but as I continued writing, they grew longer. I wasn't as alone as the Morrison family wanted me to believe. My first call was to my old college roommate, Elena Vasquez. She'd graduated with a degree in journalism and now worked as an investigative reporter for the Orange County Register. We'd kept in touch sporadically since graduation, but she'd always told me to call if I ever needed anything. I'd never imagined I'd need to take her up on that offer. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Jessica Chen, as I live and breathe. How's married life treating you?" I almost laughed at the irony of the question. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Are you free to meet today? I have a story you might be interested in, and I could really use a friend right now." There was a pause, and when Elena spoke again, her tone had shifted to the sharp focus I remembered from our college days when she was chasing down sources for the campus newspaper. "What kind of story are we talking about?" "The kind that involves tax evasion, money laundering, and a very prominent Orange County family trying to frame their pregnant daughter-in-law to cover their tracks." Elena's whistle was low and appreciative. I'll be wherever you are in an hour. Text me the address. While I waited for Elena, I called my supervisor at Hamilton and Associates. Patricia answered her personal cell phone with the casual tone of someone enjoying her weekend, but her voice became concerned when she heard the strain in mine. "Jessica, honey, what's wrong? You sound terrible." I gave her the abbreviated version. Family emergency, need to take immediate leave, would explain more when I could. Patricia had always been supportive of my career and understanding about the challenges of being pregnant while maintaining a demanding client load. I hated being vague with her, but I couldn't risk word getting back to the Morrison family before I was ready to make my move. "Take all the time you need," Patricia said. "Your job will be here when you're ready to come back. And Jessica, if there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, you call me immediately." Her kindness almost broke me. After days of betrayal and cruelty, genuine human compassion felt foreign and overwhelming. I promised to keep in touch and hung up before I started crying again. Elena arrived at the motel looking exactly like I remembered her from college. Fierce intelligence wrapped in professional polish, with an energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. She took one look at me and immediately pulled me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and righteous indignation. "Okay," she said, settling into the room's single chair while I perched on the edge of the bed. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." I told her everything. The basement documents, the Morrison family's systematic surveillance of me, the fabricated evidence, the ultimatum, David's betrayal. Elena took notes in the distinctive shorthand she'd developed in journalism school, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening with the focused attention of someone who understood the gravity of what she was hearing. When I finished, Elena set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jessica, do you understand what you've stumbled into here? This isn't just family drama or even criminal activity. This is a story that could bring down one of Orange County's most prominent business families. The ripple effects would be enormous." I nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders. "I know. That's why they're so desperate to discredit me and make me disappear. As long as I'm out there knowing what I know, I'm a threat to everything they've built." Elena leaned forward, her journalist instincts fully engaged. "The question is, what do you want to do about it? Because once we start pulling this thread, there's no going back. Your life, your ex-husband's life, their entire family structure, it's all going to change permanently." I thought about David, about the man I'd fallen in love with and married. Did he know about his family's criminal activities, or was he as much a victim of their manipulation as I was? Part of me hoped he was innocent, that he'd been deceived by the same people who'd betrayed me. But another part of me, the part that was growing stronger by the hour, didn't care anymore. He'd chosen them over me without even giving me a chance to defend myself. Whatever consequences followed from that choice were his to bear. "I want the truth to come out," I said finally. "All of it. I want people to know what the Morrison family really is, and I want justice for what they've done to me." Elena smiled, and it was the predatory grin of a reporter who'd just been handed the story of a lifetime. "Then we're going to need more than your testimony and some documents you saw in a basement. We need evidence that will hold up in court and in print. Are you prepared for what that's going to take?" Over the next several hours, Elena helped me develop a strategy that was both thorough and careful. We couldn't afford to make mistakes or give the Morrison family any opportunity to claim we were acting unethically or illegally. Everything we did had to be above board, documented, and defensible. The first step was gathering my own financial records and proving that I'd never engaged in any of the activities they'd accused me of. Elena helped me contact my banks, credit card companies, and cell phone provider to request detailed statements and activity logs. We needed to establish a clear paper trail showing that I hadn't taken any unauthorized photos, hadn't communicated with Morrison Industries, and hadn't made any of the suspicious purchases they'd claimed. While we waited for those records to arrive, Elena began researching the Morrison family's business dealings using public records and databases available to journalists. What she found was fascinating and disturbing. Robert Morrison's companies had been involved in numerous real estate transactions over the past decade that showed patterns consistent with money laundering. Properties purchased for cash at inflated prices, held for minimal periods, then sold to shell companies for substantial profits. "This is sophisticated," Elena said, scrolling through property records on her laptop. "Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. The transactions are structured to stay just under reporting thresholds, the timing is designed to avoid scrutiny, and the shell companies are layered deep enough that it would take a forensic accountant weeks to trace the actual ownership." I studied the records over her shoulder, my professional training allowing me to see patterns that might not be obvious to someone without accounting experience. "Elena, this isn't just tax evasion. This is active money laundering on a massive scale, the kind of thing that attracts federal attention from multiple agencies." She nodded grimly, "Which explains why they're so desperate to neutralize you. Your professional background makes you uniquely dangerous to them. You don't just know their secrets, you understand the technical aspects well enough to explain them to prosecutors and juries." As evening approached, Elena helped me think through the personal implications of what we were planning. Exposing the Morrison family would inevitably destroy my marriage permanently and ensure that my relationship with David could never be repaired. It would also mean giving up any hope of the comfortable life I'd been building and accepting that my child would grow up in the middle of a very public scandal. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Elena asked gently. "Because once we publish this story, there's no taking it back. Your life is going to be completely different, and not all of those changes will be easy ones." I looked down at my belly, where my daughter was moving restlessly as if she could sense my agitation. In a few months, she would be born into a world where her father's family was either in prison or completely discredited. She might grow up with questions about her identity and her place in a family torn apart by scandal. Those were heavy burdens for a child to carry. But she would also grow up knowing that her mother had stood up for the truth when it mattered most. She would know that some things are more important than comfort or security or maintaining appearances. She would learn that integrity isn't something you can compromise without losing essential parts of yourself. "I'm sure," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Whatever happens, I want my daughter to be proud of the choice I made." Elena squeezed my hand. "Then we're going to make sure she has every reason to be proud." That night, after Elena left with promises to begin making contacts at federal agencies the next morning, I sat alone in the motel room and began the most difficult part of my preparation. I started writing down everything I could remember about my relationship with David and his family, searching for signs I'd missed or warning signals I'd ignored. The more I wrote, the more I realized how carefully orchestrated my entire marriage had been. David's initial approach to me at the coffee shop near campus hadn't been the random encounter I'd believed. He'd known I was an accounting major, known about my academic performance, known about my family's financial struggles. Our entire courtship had been structured to make me feel rescued and grateful rather than valued as an equal partner. The heir, Morrison family's acceptance of me hadn't been about love or genuine affection. It had been about evaluation and control. They'd welcomed me as long as I stayed in my assigned role. The grateful outsider who brought respectability and professional skills to their family without asking uncomfortable questions or challenging their authority. Even David's proposal had been calculated. He'd waited until I was emotionally dependent on his family's approval, until I was isolated from my old support systems and completely invested in building a future with them. By the time he'd asked me to marry him, saying no would have meant losing not just him but the entire world I'd been gradually absorbed into. I thought about all the small moments that had seemed like love, but now looked like manipulation. David encouraging me to share details about my work clients. his family's interest in my professional connections and access to confidential information. The way they'd gradually made me feel like their approval was essential to my happiness and security. Most painful of all were the memories of genuine moments that I now questioned. Had David ever really loved me? Or had I always been a strategic acquisition? Had Margaret's maternal warmth been real, or had it been performance designed to make me compliant and trusting? Had any of the affection and acceptance I'd felt been authentic, or had it all been carefully crafted manipulation? I would probably never know the answers to those questions, and that uncertainty would be something I'd have to live with. But sitting in that shabby motel room, writing by the light of a flickering desk lamp while my daughter moved restlessly in my womb, I realized that the answers didn't matter as much as I'd thought they would. What mattered was who I chose to be moving forward. I could let the Morrison family's betrayal define me, could spend the rest of my life as a victim of their manipulation and cruelty, or I could use this experience as fuel for becoming someone stronger, more self-reliant, and more committed to living according to my own values rather than seeking other people's approval. The choice seemed obvious when I framed it that way. I wasn't just fighting for justice or revenge. I was fighting for the right to define my own identity and build my own future, regardless of what anyone else thought about my choices. My phone buzzed with another anonymous text. Last chance to do this the easy way. Think about what's best for everyone involved. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. They were still trying to control me through fear and intimidation, still assuming I was the same vulnerable woman they'd married into their family 3 years ago. Tomorrow, they would begin to learn just how wrong they were about me. And once that process started, nothing would ever be the same for any of us. I turned off the lights and settled into the uncomfortable motel bed, one hand resting protectively on my belly while my mind raced with plans and possibilities. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something that wasn't fear, or despair, or rage. I felt hope. Not for reconciliation or return to my old life, but for the possibility of building something entirely new. Something honest and authentic and strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The Morrison family had tried to erase me, to make me disappear quietly into whatever exile they'd constructed. Instead, they'd awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. They'd reminded me who I really was beneath all the layers of wife and daughter-in-law and grateful outsider. I was Jessica Chen, and I was nobody's victim. Tomorrow, I would begin proving that to everyone who doubted it, including myself. Elena's contacts at the federal level moved faster than I'd expected. Within 48 hours of our meeting, I was sitting in a sterile conference room in the Ronald Reagan Federal Building in Santa Ana, facing 2 agents who looked like they'd stepped out of a television crime drama. Agent Sarah Martinez from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was a woman about my age, with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit. Agent Thomas Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, represented the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and had the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't easily impressed. I spread the copies of documents I'd managed to recreate from memory across the conference table, along with Elena's research into the Morrison family's property transactions and shell company structures. The agents examined everything with the methodical thoroughness of people who'd built careers on turning financial breadcrumbs into federal cases. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Martinez said, looking up from a particularly damning set of property transfer records, "what you've brought us represents potentially millions of dollars in unreported income and tax liability. But you understand that testimony from an estranged family member isn't going to be sufficient to build a prosecution case." I nodded, having expected this response. "I understand, but I also know that what I've shown you provides probable cause for subpoenas and search warrants. Once you have access to their actual financial records and computer systems, you'll find evidence that's much more comprehensive than anything I could provide." Agent Chen leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Tell us about your professional background. What qualifies you to interpret these financial documents and identify potential criminal activity? I outlined my education and experience in forensic accounting, my client base at Hamilton and Associates, and my familiarity with the types of financial structures commonly used for money laundering and tax evasion. Both agents took detailed notes, and I could see them calculating how my professional credentials would play with prosecutors and juries. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app. "I've been receiving threatening messages since I left the family home. Intimidation tactics designed to prevent me from cooperating with law enforcement." I played the voicemails and read the text messages aloud, while Agent Martinez recorded everything on her own device. The agents exchanged a look that suggested these threats had just elevated the case to a different level of priority. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Chen said carefully, "are you prepared for what cooperation with this investigation is going to mean for your personal life? Federal financial crimes cases can take years to resolve, and your testimony will be a matter of public record. Your relationship with your husband and his family will be permanently destroyed." I looked down at my hands, folded over my growing belly where my daughter was moving restlessly. "Agent Chen, my relationship with my husband's family was destroyed the moment they decided to frame me for crimes I didn't commit in order to protect their own criminal enterprise. I'm not here to save my marriage or maintain family relationships. I'm here because federal crimes were committed, and I have information that can help you prove it." The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, both agents had assured me that the information I'd provided was sufficient to open a formal investigation and that I would be protected under federal whistleblower statutes. They explained the timeline for obtaining search warrants and the process for seizing financial records from multiple banks and shell companies. Agent Martinez walked me to the elevator when we finished. "Jessica," she said, using my first name, "for the first time, what you're doing takes extraordinary courage. Most people in your situation would take whatever deal they could get and disappear quietly. Are you sure you're prepared for the consequences of this choice?" I thought about the alternative she was suggesting: accepting the Morrison family's ultimatum, signing their papers, giving up custody of my daughter, and relocating to some distant city where I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder and wondering if they'd ever decide I was still too much of a threat to leave. "Alone, Agent Martinez," I said. "The only thing I'm not prepared for is living the rest of my life as a victim of people who think they're above the law." 3 weeks later, I was working in Elena's guest bedroom when she burst through the door with her laptop and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jessica, you need to see this. It's happening." The screen showed a live news feed from outside the Morrison family's estate. Federal agents were carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment to unmarked vans while news crews captured everything from behind police barriers. The reporter's voice carried clearly through the laptop speakers. Federal agents have executed search warrants at multiple properties owned by prominent Orange County businessman Robert Morrison and his family members, as part of what sources describe as a major financial crimes investigation. I watched Robert being led from his house in handcuffs, his face pale and shocked in a way that suggested he'd never imagined this moment would come. Margaret followed in the custody of a female agent, her perfect composure finally cracking as photographers captured her humiliation. Lisa and Mark were arrested at their respective apartments, their shocked expressions suggesting they'd believed their father's assurances that they were untouchable. David appeared briefly in the footage, not in handcuffs but clearly being questioned, by agents outside the townhouse that had been our home. He looked lost and confused, like someone who'd just discovered that everything he'd believed about his life had been a lie. I felt a moment of sympathy for him before remembering that he'd chosen to believe his family's fabricated evidence against me without ever giving me a chance to defend myself. Elena sat beside me on the bed, her hand on my shoulder as we watched my former family's world collapse in real time. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. I'd expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, maybe even satisfied by their downfall. Instead, I felt something more complex and nuanced. Relief that the truth was finally coming out. Sadness for the life I'd thought I was building that had turned out to be built on lies. Determination to use this experience to build something, authentic and lasting for my daughter and myself. "I feel free," I said finally. "For the first time in months, I feel completely free." The federal investigation moved with remarkable speed once it began. The search warrants yielded exactly what I'd predicted: extensive documentation of sophisticated money laundering operations, unreported offshore accounts containing millions of dollars, and evidence of systematic tax fraud going back nearly a decade. The Morrison family's carefully constructed facade of legitimate business success crumbled under forensic accounting scrutiny. Robert Morrison was indicted on 14 federal charges, including money laundering, tax evasion, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and witness intimidation. The witness intimidation charges were based on the threatening messages I'd received and testimony from other people who'd been silenced or discredited when they'd posed threats to the family's operations. Margaret, Lisa, and Mark all faced their own charges as accomplices in the money laundering scheme. The prosecution's case was strengthened by evidence that they'd all knowingly participated in creating false documentation and intimidating potential witnesses. Their attempts to frame me were treated as part of a larger pattern of obstruction of justice. David's situation was more complicated. Prosecutors determined that while he'd benefited from his family's criminal activities, there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove he'd knowingly participated in the money laundering operation. However, his role in the conspiracy to discredit me made him a target of civil lawsuits and professional sanctions that would follow him for years. My testimony before the federal grand jury was detailed and technical, walking prosecutors through the financial documents I'd discovered and explaining how the Morrison family's various business transactions fit together into a comprehensive criminal enterprise. My professional credentials and the thorough documentation Elena and I had prepared made me a compelling witness, and the grand jury returned indictments on all requested counts. The civil litigation that followed was almost as satisfying as the criminal prosecution. My attorney, recommended by Elena and working on contingency, filed lawsuits for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and violation of my civil rights. The discovery process in these civil cases revealed even more evidence of the Morrison family's systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and credibility. David's divorce attorney tried to maintain custody claims based on the family's original allegations against me, but the federal criminal case had completely discredited their evidence. The court awarded me full custody of my daughter with supervised visitation rights for David, contingent on his cooperation with ongoing investigations and his completion of counseling programs. The financial settlements from both the civil lawsuits and the federal whistleblower program were substantial enough to ensure my daughter and I would never face the kind of economic vulnerability that had made me an attractive target for the Morrison family's manipulation in the first place. I used part of the money to purchase a modest house in Laguna Beach, far enough from Orange County's business community to provide privacy, but close enough to maintain my professional connections. Isabella Marie Chen was born on a foggy Tuesday morning in February, 3 weeks after Robert Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. I held her in the hospital room I'd paid for with my own money, surrounded by friends I'd chosen rather than family I'd been assigned to, and felt a peace I'd never experienced before. Elena was there, of course, having documented my entire journey for a series of investigative articles that won her a Pulitzer Prize nomination. My former supervisor, Patricia, had driven down from Orange County to meet the baby and offer me a partnership position at a new forensic accounting firm specializing in financial crime investigation. My grandmother, now in her 80s but still sharp as a blade, held her great-granddaughter and whispered prayers in Mandarin that I hoped would protect Isabella from ever experiencing the kind of betrayal I'd survived. David visited once, 6 months after Isabella was born. He looked older, worn down by the collapse of everything he'd thought he knew about his family and himself. We sat in my living room while Isabella napped in her crib, and he tried to apologize for believing his family's lies about me. "I don't know how to make this right," he said, his voice hollow with regret. "I don't know how to undo the choice I made to trust them instead of you." I looked at this man I'd once loved, this father of my child who'd chosen his family's criminal conspiracy over his wife's innocence, and felt nothing but mild sadness for what we'd both lost. "David," I said gently, "there is no making this right. There's only learning to live with the consequences of our choices and trying to do better going forward." He nodded, understanding that our marriage was truly over, and that whatever relationship we might maintain would be purely about co-parenting Isabella. When he left that day, I felt the final chapter of my old life closing and knew I was ready to fully embrace whatever came next. The years that followed were not easy, but they were authentic in ways my marriage had never been. I built a successful forensic accounting practice specializing in financial crime investigation, working with federal agencies and private attorneys to uncover the kind of sophisticated fraud schemes I'd first encountered in the Morrison family's basement. My professional reputation, once threatened by their false accusations, became stronger than ever as my expertise in complex financial crimes made me one of the most sought-after expert witnesses in California. Isabella grew up knowing the truth about her father's family, age-appropriately but honestly. I wanted her to understand that people sometimes make terrible choices when they're afraid or greedy, but that those choices have consequences that affect innocent people. I also wanted her to know that her mother had chosen truth over comfort, justice over security, and integrity over acceptance. Margaret Morrison died in federal prison 18 months into her sentence, her health deteriorating rapidly under the stress of incarceration and the complete destruction of her social standing. I felt sadness for her death, but no guilt about my role in her downfall. She'd made choices that destroyed multiple lives, including her own. And the consequences of those choices weren't my responsibility to bear. Robert served 8 years of his 12-year sentence before being released to a halfway house, his health broken, and his fortune completely gone to legal fees and civil settlements. Lisa and Mark both served shorter sentences, but emerged from prison to find their professional reputations destroyed and their social connections severed. The Morrison family name, once synonymous with success and respectability in Orange County business circles, became associated with fraud and corruption. David eventually remarried, a quiet woman who worked as a teacher and had no interest in wealth or social status. They had 2 children together, and he seemed to find some measure of peace in the simple life he built with her. His relationship with Isabella was cordial but distant, more like a family friend than a father. She called him David rather than Dad, and seemed to understand instinctively that her real family was the one we'd built together, rather than the one defined by biology. On Isabella's 5th birthday, she asked me why her daddy's family had been so mean to us. We were sitting in our garden, watching hummingbirds feed from the flowers we'd planted together, and her question was delivered with the matter-of-fact curiosity that characterizes children her age. "Sometimes people do bad things because they're scared," I told her, choosing my words carefully. David's family was doing things that were against the law, and they were scared that someone would find out. When people are really scared, they sometimes hurt innocent people to protect themselves. She considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all complex topics. "But you found out anyway," she said finally. "I did," I agreed. And I had to decide whether to keep their secret or tell the truth, even though telling the truth would make our lives very difficult. Isabella looked at me with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "You picked the truth," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I picked the truth," I confirmed. "Because the truth is always more important than being comfortable or safe or popular." She nodded and returned her attention to the hummingbirds, apparently satisfied with this explanation of the events that had shaped both our lives. Watching her process this information with such calm acceptance, I realized that she was growing up with a strength and clarity that I'd had to fight to rediscover. She would never doubt her worth or seek validation from people who didn't deserve her trust. She would never compromise her integrity for acceptance or security. The Morrison family had tried to erase me from their story, to make me disappear quietly into whatever exile they'd constructed. Instead, they'd given me the opportunity to discover who I really was beneath all the layers of wife and daughter-in-law, and grateful outsider. They'd forced me to choose between comfort and truth, between security and integrity, between their approval and my own self-respect. I'd chosen truth, integrity, and self-respect, and those choices had led to a life that was more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have built on the foundation of their lies. Isabella and I lived in a house we owned, surrounded by friends we'd chosen, building a future that belonged entirely to us. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd never found those documents in the Morrison family's basement, if I'd remained ignorant of their criminal activities and continued living the comfortable lie they'd constructed around me. Would I have been happy in that ignorance? Would Isabella have grown up as part of their world, unknowingly benefiting from the proceeds of their crimes? The questions were unanswerable and ultimately irrelevant. I'd found the documents, learned the truth, and made my choices based on that knowledge. The path I'd chosen had been difficult and painful, but it had led to a life built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Elena often said that I'd gotten the best possible revenge on the Morrison family by building a life that was more successful and fulfilling than anything I could have achieved as David's wife. But revenge had never been my motivation. I'd simply refused to accept their version of who I was supposed to be and insisted on defining myself according to my own values and standards. The Morrison family had believed they could control me through fear, manipulation, and economic pressure. They'd assumed that threatening my security and comfort would be enough to ensure my silence about their crimes. They'd never imagined that their betrayal would awaken something in me that was stronger than their threats and more durable than their money. They'd tried to make me disappear, but instead they'd helped me discover exactly who I was meant to be. And the woman I'd become was someone they could never have controlled, never have diminished, and never have erased from her own story. Isabella and I were exactly where we belonged, free, authentic, and strong enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The Morrison family had given us that gift, though they'd never intended to. For that, I supposed, I owed them a debt of gratitude. But I'd never tell them that. Some secrets are worth keeping. 10 years had passed since that devastating Saturday when the Morrison family had torn my world apart, and I was standing in the marble lobby of the Orange County Superior Court, waiting for what would be the final chapter of our legal saga. Isabella, now a confident 10-year-old with my dark hair but her father's stubborn chin, sat beside me on the polished bench, her legs swinging as she read a book about marine biology. She'd developed an early fascination with ocean creatures, particularly sharks, which I found symbolically appropriate given what we'd survived together. The irony of our presence in this courthouse wasn't lost on me. Robert Morrison, now 68 and looking every day of his age after a decade of legal battles and health problems, was petitioning the court for permission to see his granddaughter. The man who'd orchestrated my destruction, who'd tried to steal my child and destroy my reputation, was now reduced to begging for supervised visits with the daughter he'd tried to take from me. My attorney, Jennifer Walsh, approached with the confident stride of someone who'd never lost a custody case. She'd been representing Isabella and me for 3 years, ever since David had died in a car accident and Robert had begun his campaign to gain grandparental rights. Jennifer was everything I'd learned to value in professional relationships: competent, ethical, and completely unimpressed by wealth or social status. "Jessica," she said, settling beside me with her briefcase, reviewed Morrison's petition one more time. His arguments haven't improved since the last filing. No substantial change in circumstances. No evidence of Isabella's best interests being served by contact with him. The judge should deny this quickly. Isabella looked up from her book, her dark eyes serious in the way that always reminded me she'd grown up understanding adult complexities earlier than most children. "Mom, is the scary grandpa going to try to take me away again?" I smoothed her hair, marveling at how matter-of-factly she referred to Robert Morrison. She had no emotional connection to him whatsoever, viewing him as simply another adult who'd caused problems for our family. Her psychological health assessments consistently showed a well-adjusted child with strong attachment bonds and no anxiety about her family situation, which was remarkable considering the circumstances of her early years. "No, sweetheart," I assured her. "Remember what we talked about? Sometimes adults make mistakes and then spend a long time trying to fix them. But you're safe with me, and no one can change that." She nodded and returned to her book, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Her resilience never ceased, to amaze me. She'd grown up hearing age-appropriate versions of our family's history, and rather than being traumatized by the knowledge, she'd developed an unusually strong sense of justice and an ability to see through manipulation that served her well in school and social situations. The bailiff called our case, and we entered the courtroom where Robert Morrison sat with his new attorney, looking frail and desperate in a way that might have elicited sympathy if I hadn't known exactly what he was capable of. His wife, Margaret, had died 5 years earlier, taking with her any moderating influence on his obsession with gaining access to Isabella. Lisa lived in Arizona now, working as a bookkeeper under an assumed name and struggling with addiction issues that had started during her imprisonment. Mark had disappeared entirely after his release, and even his father's private investigators hadn't been able to locate him. David's death had been the catalyst for Robert's renewed interest in his granddaughter. The car accident had been genuinely accidental, a case of black ice and bad timing during a business trip to Colorado, but it had left Isabella without any connection to the Morrison side of her family, except for her grandfather. Robert had convinced himself that this tragedy gave him moral standing to claim a relationship with his only grandchild. Judge Patricia Henderson was a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on family law and had a reputation for putting children's welfare above all other considerations. She'd presided over our initial custody hearings when Isabella was born, and I suspected she remembered the Morrison family's criminal case and my role in exposing their activities. Robert's attorney, a young man who clearly didn't know the full history of his client's legal troubles, began with a standard presentation about the importance of grandparent-grandchild relationships and the tragic loss of David creating a need for continued family connections. His arguments were competent, but generic, lacking any specific evidence that contact with Robert would benefit Isabella in any meaningful way. When Jennifer stood to respond, her presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. She outlined Robert's criminal history, his role in the conspiracy to destroy my reputation and steal custody of Isabella when she was unborn, and the complete absence of any prior relationship between him and his granddaughter. She presented psychological evaluations showing Isabella's excellent mental health and strong family bonds, along with expert testimony that introducing a potentially destabilizing influence could be harmful to her development. "Your Honor," Jennifer concluded, "Mr. Morrison is asking this court to grant him access to a child he's never met, based solely on biological connection to a man who chose to have minimal involvement in her life. There is no evidence that such contact would serve Isabella's best interests, and substantial evidence that Mr. Morrison's history of manipulation and intimidation makes him unsuitable for any role in her upbringing." The judge asked Robert if he wished to address the court directly. He stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the table for support. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade's worth of loss and regret. "Your Honor, I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I hurt Jessica and tried to keep her from her own child. I've spent 10 years in prison and lost everything I worked my whole life to build. My wife is dead, my children are scattered and broken, and my son is gone forever. Isabella is all I have left of David, and I just want the chance to know her. To maybe leave her something good from our family instead of just shame and scandal. It was a compelling speech, delivered with apparent sincerity and genuine emotion. If I hadn't known Robert Morrison's capacity for manipulation and performance, I might have been moved by his apparent remorse and desperation. But I'd learned to see past surface presentations to the calculating mind beneath, and I recognized this plea as another strategic move in his long campaign to control narratives and outcomes. Isabella, who'd been quietly drawing in her notebook throughout the proceedings, looked up when Robert mentioned her name. She studied him with the same detached curiosity she might show toward an unfamiliar animal at the zoo, then returned to her artwork without apparent interest or recognition. Judge Henderson asked me if I wished to respond to Robert's statement. I stood carefully, aware that this might be the last time I'd ever have to defend my family against Morrison family interference. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison speaks about wanting to give Isabella something good from their family, but the truth is that she already has everything good that family had to offer. She has her father's intelligence and curiosity, his love of reading and learning. She has the strength and resilience that come from surviving difficult circumstances. What she doesn't need is exposure to the manipulation and ethical flexibility that characterized her grandfather's approach to family relationships. I paused, looking directly at Robert for the first time since entering the courtroom. Isabella knows her family history, age-appropriately but honestly. She knows that sometimes people make terrible choices when they're afraid or desperate, and she knows that those choices have consequences that affect innocent people. She's learned these lessons without having to experience manipulation or betrayal directly, and I believe that's the greatest gift I can give her. Judge Henderson nodded thoughtfully, then addressed Isabella directly. Isabella, do you understand why we're here today? My daughter closed her notebook and looked up at the judge with perfect composure. Yes, ma'am. The man over there wants to spend time with me because he's my daddy's father, but my daddy didn't really spend time with me either, so I don't think. Family is just about who you're related to. The judge smiled slightly at this remarkably mature response. That's very wise, Isabella. Is there anything you'd like me to know about what you think would be best for you? Isabella considered this question with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. I think I'm happy the way things are. My mom and I have a good life, and we have friends who are like family to us. Adding new people just because they're related seems like it might make things more complicated without making them better. I felt a surge of pride at her thoughtful response. She'd articulated better than any attorney could have why forced relationships based solely on biological connection weren't in her best interests. Her emotional intelligence and self-awareness were remarkable for a child her age, and they demonstrated clearly that our small family unit was providing everything she needed for healthy development. Judge Henderson took 15 minutes to review the case materials before delivering her ruling. Mr. Morrison, I understand your desire to connect with your granddaughter, and I don't doubt that your remorse about past actions is genuine. However, the court's primary concern must be Isabella's welfare, not your emotional needs or desire for redemption. She continued, Isabella is a well-adjusted, happy child who has strong family bonds and excellent psychological health. There is no evidence that adding you to her life would enhance her well-being, and substantial evidence that doing so could introduce instability and confusion. Your petition for grandparental visitation is denied. The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom with a finality that seemed to close not just this legal proceeding, but an entire chapter of our lives. Robert Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat, and I watched him age visibly as he processed the reality that he would never have a relationship with Isabella. His attorney gathered their papers quickly, apparently eager to escape what had clearly been a hopeless case from the beginning. Outside the courthouse, Isabella skipped ahead while Jennifer and I discussed the final paperwork that would formally close all legal matters between the Morrison family and us. The restraining orders would remain in place indefinitely, ensuring that Robert couldn't attempt future contact with either of us without facing criminal charges. "Jessica," Jennifer said as we reached our cars, "I want you to know that in 20 years of family law practice, I've never seen a parent handle a situation like this with more grace and strength. Isabella is incredibly lucky to have you as her mother." I thanked her and promised to stay in touch, though I hoped this would be the last time I'd need her professional services for Morrison-related matters. As I drove home with Isabella chattering about her plans for the weekend, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that devastating Saturday a decade earlier. The forensic accounting firm I'd built had grown into one of the most respected financial investigation companies on the West Coast. We employed 12 people and worked with federal agencies, major law firms, and corporate clients to uncover complex fraud schemes and financial crimes. My expertise in cases like the Morrison investigation had made me a sought-after expert witness and consultant, and I'd testified in dozens of high-profile cases over the years. More importantly, I'd used my experience to help other people who'd found themselves targeted by powerful individuals or families trying to cover up their criminal activities. We'd established a pro bono program that provided forensic accounting services to whistleblowers and victims of financial fraud who couldn't afford our usual rates. Helping people fight back against the kind of systematic manipulation I'd experienced had become not just professionally rewarding, but personally healing. Isabella and I lived in a beautiful house in Dana Point, with ocean views from every room, and a garden where we grew vegetables and flowers together. She was an excellent student who'd inherited my love of numbers and puzzles, but she'd also developed artistic talents and social skills that I'd never possessed. She played violin in the school orchestra, participated in marine biology camps every summer, and had a close group of friends whose families had become part of our extended chosen family. Our life was rich and full in ways that my marriage to David had never been. We made decisions based on our own values and interests rather than trying to fit into someone else's expectations. We traveled when and where we wanted, choosing destinations based on Isabella's fascination with different ecosystems rather than social obligations or business requirements. We celebrated holidays with friends who genuinely cared about us, rather than family members who saw us as assets to be managed or problems to be solved. Elena had remained one of our closest friends throughout the years, and Isabella considered her an honorary aunt. Elena's Pulitzer Prize-winning series about the Morrison case had launched her career as a nationally recognized investigative journalist, and she'd used that platform to expose other cases of financial crime and family corruption. She'd never married or had children of her own, but she was deeply involved in Isabella's life and served as an excellent role model for how women could build successful careers while maintaining strong personal relationships. David's death had been genuinely tragic, and I'd grieved for the man I'd once loved even though our marriage had ended badly. Isabella had attended his funeral and met some of his colleagues and friends, which had given her a more complete picture of who her father had been beyond his role in our family's drama. She'd decided on her own to keep one photo of him on her dresser, not as a shrine, but as acknowledgement of his place in her history. The financial settlements from our lawsuits against the Morrison family had provided security that went far beyond basic needs. I'd invested conservatively and lived modestly, ensuring that Isabella would have resources for college and beyond, without ever having to depend on anyone else's financial support. More importantly, I'd taught her to manage money responsibly and understand the difference between wealth and security, between having resources and being defined by them. Isabella's relationship with money was healthy and grounded in ways mine had never been at her age. She understood that our comfortable lifestyle was the result of hard work and difficult choices, not luck or inheritance. She'd learned to value experiences over possessions and relationships over status. She volunteered at the local animal shelter and participated in beach cleanup programs, developing a sense of social responsibility that would serve her well as she grew older. As we pulled into our driveway that afternoon, Isabella asked if we could make cookies for our neighbors, the elderly couple next door who'd been especially kind to us since we'd moved to Dana Point. This impulse toward generosity and community connection was typical of her character, and I marveled again at how she'd grown up to be such a thoughtful and caring person, despite the dramatic circumstances of her early years. While we baked chocolate chip cookies together, Isabella talked about her plans for high school and college, still years away but already taking shape in her organized mind. She wanted to study marine biology and environmental science, with the goal of protecting ocean ecosystems and the creatures that lived in them. Her passion for this work was genuine and deep, and I had no doubt she'd succeed in whatever field she ultimately chose. "Mom," she said while we waited for the cookies to bake, "do you ever wish things had been different? Like, if the Morrison family hadn't been criminals and we could have had a normal family?" It was a question she'd asked variations of over the years, always with the same thoughtful curiosity rather than resentment or sadness. I'd learned to answer honestly while emphasizing the positive aspects of our situation. "Sometimes I wonder what a different life might have looked like," I said carefully, "but I can't imagine loving anyone more than I love you, or being prouder of the person you're becoming. If things had been different, you might not have developed the strength and independence that make you so special." She considered this, while decorating cookies with rainbow sprinkles. "I think we're lucky," she said finally. "We get to choose our family instead of just being stuck with whoever we're related to." Her words perfectly captured what I'd learned over the past decade. Family wasn't about blood relationships or legal obligations. It was about people who showed up consistently, who supported each other through difficulties, who celebrated successes without jealousy or competition. Isabella and I had built that kind of family with Elena, with our neighbors, with colleagues and friends who'd become integral parts of our lives. That evening, after Isabella had gone to bed, I sat in my home office reviewing files for a new case involving a tech startup whose CFO had been embezzling funds through a complex cryptocurrency scheme. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating, requiring the same kind of financial detective work that had first exposed the Morrison family's crimes. Each case was different, but they all shared common elements: people in positions of trust who'd chosen greed over integrity, and victims who needed someone with specialized knowledge to help them fight back. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena, who was working on a story about political corruption in Sacramento. "Saw the news about today's hearing. How are you feeling about finally closing that chapter?" I thought about her question before responding. Relieved, mostly, and proud of Isabella for handling it so maturely, ready to focus completely on the future without looking backward. Elena's response came quickly. "You should be proud of yourself too. What you've built from the ashes of that situation is remarkable." She was right, though it had taken me years to fully appreciate the transformation that had occurred in my life. The Morrison family's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also freed me from illusions about security and belonging that had been limiting my potential. I'd learned to rely on my own judgment rather than seeking approval from people who didn't have my best interests at heart. I'd discovered reserves of strength and resilience I'd never known I possessed. Most importantly, I'd learned to define success and happiness according to my own values rather than external expectations. The life Isabella and I had built together was authentic and fulfilling in ways that my marriage to David had never been, even during its happiest moments. We were free to be completely ourselves, to make choices based on our own interests and principles, to build relationships with people who valued us for who we truly were, rather than what we could provide for them. Standing at my office window, looking out at the Pacific Ocean where Isabella loved to watch for dolphins and whales, I realized that the Morrison family had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. By trying to destroy me, they'd forced me to discover who I really was beneath all the layers of wife and daughter-in-law and grateful outsider. By attempting to erase me from their story, they'd compelled me to write my own story according to my own vision of what a meaningful life should look like. Isabella and I were exactly where we belonged, free, authentic, and strong enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The Morrison family had tried to define us as victims of their manipulation and greed, but we'd refused to accept that identity. Instead, we'd chosen to see ourselves as survivors who'd used our experience to build something beautiful and lasting. The woman I'd become was someone the Morrison family could never have controlled, never have diminished, and never have erased from her own story. And the daughter I was raising would grow up knowing that her worth came from within herself, not from other people's approval or acceptance. We'd not just survived their attempt to destroy us, we'd thrived beyond anything they could have imagined, and we'd done it by choosing truth over comfort, integrity over security, and authentic relationships over convenient arrangements. The Morrison family's legacy would always be one of crime and corruption, of broken relationships and squandered opportunities. Our legacy would be one of resilience and growth, of building something meaningful from the wreckage of other people's choices. And that, I realized, was the sweetest vindication of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.